It seems that Hollywood has long lost touch with reality, because we're no longer surprised by news that another film cost $250 million just for production, not even counting marketing. Usually, such amounts are spent on something that is guaranteed to bring profit by grossing $1 billion, or even $1.5 billion. However, sometimes very strange situations happen. For example, in 2024, a new installment of a legendary adventure franchise was released. It cost Disney $350 million, but earned only $380 million, resulting in losses of several hundred million. This film was Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, starring an 80-year-old Harrison Ford. The movie simply had no chance of recouping such a budget. The franchise is objectively nowhere near as popular as it was even 20 years ago, not to mention 40. Ford can no longer perform most action scenes on his own. And such a massive budget essentially doomed the film to failure even before release. Why was the budget so huge? There were several reasons. First, the age of the main actor. Not only could he no longer do complex stunts himself, but the filmmakers also decided to de-age him using CGI. And just a few scenes with a young Ford cost the studio tens of millions. Then, of course, the pandemic and its restrictions interfered with production. This film suffered especially hard because the shooting took place on real locations all over the world. In the end, $350 million was not even as expensive as it could have been. And that made me curious. What are the most expensive films in history overall? So far, without adjusting for inflation. I'll share the results of my research with you in this video. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. I see that most of you are watching without subscribing. And we're very close to the long-awaited 10,000 subscribers. I hope you've already clicked everything you can under the video. Let's get started. And, as always, a few clarifications. For ranking the films, I used reported production budgets, since studios do not fully disclose marketing costs. In addition, even production budgets aren't fully accurate, so many positions may change once more precise information appears. And Fast and Furious 10 is one of those cases. According to different sources, the film's budget ranged from $340 to $380 million, and such a large margin significantly affected its placement on the list. That's why Fast and Furious 10 sits at number 10, symbolically. Originally, Fast and Furious started as a grounded film about street racing, and then came space, tanks, submarines, and so on. Starting from the fifth installment, the family franchise began to gain serious box office momentum. The peak of popularity came with Part 7. The eighth film dropped a little in revenue, but still made over $1 billion. But after that came a sharp decline. Part 9, which cost $225 million, was still profitable. But the 10th film, released in 2023, became the first in many years that cannot be considered a guaranteed success. Why did it cost so much? Let's start with the main reason. The family is now extremely expensive. Vin Diesel, Jason Momoa, Statham, Charlize Theron, John Cena. These are not the cheapest actors in Hollywood. The second major reason was the director change after filming had already begun. Justin Lin left the project due to creative differences. The film was essentially hanging in the air, and the studio, according to reports, was spending up to $1 million per day while urgently searching for a new director. The third factor, locations and scale. Filming took place in Italy, Portugal, the UK, and other European locations. The fourth, script rewrites and reshoots. The studio was changing some storylines during production. Several episodes were red hot. A number of scenes were reworked with CGI, which brings us to the fifth factor. The amount of visual effects here is closer to superhero movies, not to early action Fast and Furious films. Fast and Furious 10 grossed $714 million worldwide. For most films this would be a solid success, but for Fast and Furious it's one of the lowest results of the franchise's big era. Even more telling, in the domestic market the film earned only $146 million, and that's where the studio gets the largest percentage of ticket sales. And when you factor in marketing costs, the total budget reportedly climbed to a staggering $450 million. Fast and Furious 10 became a film that showed the franchise still has an international audience, but its former box office power has weakened. A record budget, internal production issues, and declining interest in key markets all turned the film into more of a warning sign than a guaranteed hit. And although the franchise can still make hundreds of millions, the cost-to-profit ratio is getting worse, especially if the next installments remain just as expensive. And Part 11 is already stuck in development hell, because Vin Diesel has imagined an epic finale, possibly more than one, with a budget of $200 to $300 million each. And the studio is simply no longer willing to take such risks. In the ranking of the most expensive modern films, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness takes 9th place. And at first glance, it looks like a typical Marvel blockbuster. But what you definitely wouldn't expect is that the Doctor Strange sequel would become the most expensive solo film in the entire MCU. The official budget of the movie was around $351 million. The multiverse isn't just expensive, it's unbelievably expensive. The reasons behind this inflated budget are actually very simple. Production began before pandemic restrictions, and once they kicked in, filming was stopped multiple times. Each pause costs millions just to maintain locations, equipment, crew, and actors. On top of that, the director of the first film, Scott Derrickson, left early in development. He was replaced by Sam Raimi, who had a completely different vision. That led to script changes and more delays. Make me regret it. Don't make me. Compared to other MCU solo films, which usually cost $150 to $250 million, this amount is enormous. So you might assume that the global lockdown inflated the budget. But other films from the same period didn't suffer as much. Shang-Chi, Eternals, Thor, Love and Thunder, and even Spider-Man: No Way Home all stayed under $250 million. Only Doctor Strange 2 broke through the $350 million mark. And with marketing included, the total spending reached around $550 million. So even though the film almost hit $1 billion at the box office, which looks very impressive, it didn't bring Marvel any record-breaking profits. Unlike Fast and Furious, here the domestic box office performed strongly, bringing almost half of the total, $440 million. Then came the releases on Disney Plus and DVD. So the film is not a failure, but it came uncomfortably close to being one. In the world of blockbusters, there are expensive films that earn a lot, expensive films that fail to meet expectations, and then there is Avengers: Endgame. A project Marvel had been building toward for 10 years, a film that brought together everything the studio had accumulated: technology, budget, star power, marketing, and a scale that cinema had quite literally never seen before. The official production budget of the movie was about $356 million, but even that looks modest, because it only puts the film in 8th place. And if we factor in marketing, analysts estimate that the promotional campaign alone cost over $200 million, making it one of the largest in the history of cinema. In any other case, spending nearly $600 million on a film would have been incredibly risky. But here Disney ended up earning almost $3 billion at the global box office, with $850 million coming from the US alone. What can I say? This is one of the most successful films of all time. For a while, Endgame even held the #1 box office spot, until a certain James decided to hold his drink and re-release Avatar. Interestingly, out of all 4 Avengers films, the final and most massive installment is not actually the most expensive one. Because the most expensive film is actually Avengers: Age of Ultron. It is officially the costliest movie in the entire MCU. The film's official budget was $365 million. And its price is easy to explain. At the time, it was Marvel's most ambitious project ever. Filming took place all over the world. The cast expanded with new characters, and after the success of the first Avengers, Age of Ultron carried enormous expectations. Expectations that, in the end, weren't fully met financially. The film earned $1.405 billion worldwide. That's a massive result, but still below what Marvel projected. They expected the movie to match or surpass the first film's success. In the US, the box office was lower than analysts predicted, although internationally it performed very well. Even so, because of the massive production and marketing costs, Age of Ultron brought Marvel less net profit than the first Avengers and several other MCU films. So why did it cost more than Endgame? In fact, it was filmed in parallel with Infinity War, which allowed the studio to save money on logistics, contracts, and moving production crews. Age of Ultron relied heavily on real-world locations, while Endgame used more studio-based sets with LED walls and complex CGI, which, surprisingly, turned out cheaper this time. Plus, during Endgame, part of the cast was still working under older contracts signed years earlier, which also helped cut costs. All of this created a situation in which Age of Ultron ended up being more expensive to produce than the grand finale of the entire saga. If today a budget of $300 to $350 million feels high for a blockbuster, but not unheard of, then back in 2011 this was completely uncharted territory. And that is exactly where Pirates of the Caribbean, on Stranger Tides, ended up. The fourth installment of the franchise was, at the time, officially considered the most expensive film ever made. Its production budget reached $379 million, which was absolutely unprecedented back then. Add another $100 to $150 million spent on marketing, and you get a project that easily crossed the $500 million mark in total expenses. This was also the moment when Johnny Depp's salary hit an absurd level. He was paid around $55 million, making him one of the highest-paid actors in the world. Disney went for a massive seafaring approach: real ships, expensive nautical sets, large-scale practical builds, and extensive on-location shoots in Hawaii. They even constructed special structures for ocean sequences. All of this created logistics that burned through tens of millions. You can't just put up a green screen and paint in the ocean. This had to be done for real, and real-world conditions are unpredictable. Filming in tropical locations meant that any bad weather or logistical delay instantly turned into real financial losses, and that's exactly what happened. Production moved between the US, the UK, and Hawaii. The last two were particularly attractive thanks to tax incentives that allowed Disney to recover part of the costs. 2011 was the post-Avatar era, when Hollywood was switching en masse to 3D. Shooting in native 3D, not converting later, required additional equipment, a bigger post-production team, and specialized technology, all of which added a heavy layer to the budget. Interestingly, filming went incredibly fast for a project of this scale, because Disney was desperate to start cutting costs once the budget crossed $300 million. The rush didn't help the movie's quality, but it did slightly reduce the financial damage. Even so, at the time of its release, On Stranger Tides remained the most expensive film in history. After the huge success of the first Jurassic World, Universal wanted a sequel that would not only be bigger in scale, but would send a clear message. The franchise was back, and ready to chase the biggest numbers possible. The result was a production cycle with a budget of about $432 million. And it's reported that this figure came after tax incentives and rebates from the countries that covered part of the costs. In some sources, the number goes as high as $465 million. The main expenses were concentrated in three key areas. First, locations and set design. The film was shot in Hawaii, the UK, and Spain. On the islands, large areas had to be closed off, rebuilt, or fully transformed, and massive sets were constructed. And that volcano scene? It's not just CGI. Universal built complex structures with real pyrotechnic elements. Second, visual effects and animatronics. The movie includes thousands of CGI shots, dozens of dinosaur species, and a blend of digital models with practical effects. The studio even created new mechanical dinosaurs specifically for this project, ones that could turn their heads, breathe, and react to touch. VFX studios worked on every single shot where even a tail tip or a shadow of a dinosaur appeared. Third, the scale of production. Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom became the first film in the franchise shot entirely on cutting-edge digital cameras. According to what's been shared online, this premium-level equipment required extra spending on lighting, data storage, specialized technicians, and a complex post-production pipeline. Add to that a large cast and a high overall production standard, and you get a budget that keeps growing at every stage. And despite such massive costs, the film grossed around $1.3 billion worldwide. It was a success for the studio, even if it earned less than the first installment. The film Avatar: The Way of Water sits in an uncertain position on this list. Why is its place unclear, and why did I put it fourth? Because it's impossible to state its exact budget with confidence. The numbers vary too much. It could easily be in 10th place, or in second. So I placed it at number 4. According to very different reports, the movie's budget ranges from $350 to $460 million. James Cameron essentially spent over 10 years creating this film. While most studios are afraid to spend more than $250 million on a blockbuster, Cameron is the kind of person who comfortably operates in the $500 million range. And The Way of Water is the best proof of that. Cameron doesn't just make movies, he invents technology. The Way of Water became the first project in history where full motion capture was performed underwater, with actors trained to hold their breath for 3 to 5 minutes. To achieve this, a new camera had to be developed, along with new sensors, new lighting systems, and new rendering methods. All of that means years of research and millions of dollars. Pandora itself isn't just a forest or an ocean, it is a fully digital world with its own ecosystem, flora, and fauna. The vast majority of the film shots contain visual effects, and the level of detail is astonishing. Specialists worked on the movie for years, creating one of the most technically complex productions in cinema history. Nothing like these VFX had ever been done before. Marketing alone cost another $150 to $200 million. And it was worth it. The movie grossed $2.32 billion worldwide. Cameron himself said that for the film to truly become profitable, it needed to finish as the third or fourth highest-grossing film of all time. And that's exactly what happened. If Marvel films could be thematically separated into different spots because each had its own slightly distinct story, then let's group Star Wars together in a single block. When Disney bought Lucasfilm, the studio didn't just plan to revive the franchise, they aimed to do it on an entirely new level. The Force Awakens had a production budget of about $447 million, which made it the most expensive film in history at the time. Why was everything so massive? The return of the original cast. Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher received salaries fitting their status as cinema legends, especially Ford, whose contract was one of the largest of his career. The studio also deliberately chose practical effects and real locations to recapture the feel of the original trilogy. This meant building enormous sets, real spacecraft, handmade costumes, and complex on-location shoots all over the world. Disney spent nearly $500 million, but the final result justified it. The film earned over $2 billion, became the highest-grossing entry in the saga, and officially relaunched the franchise. The profits were enormous. The second installment decided to take a risk, replacing director J.J. Abrams with Rian Johnson. Audiences reacted with apprehension, and the movie earned several hundred million less, only about $1.3 billion. To regain fans' love, Abrams returned for the third part of the trilogy, which cost $416 million to produce. This change required rewriting the script, which was already costly. Filming time was extremely tight, and many mistakes on expensive sets had to be corrected by VFX artists later. Looking purely at the production budget, the worldwide box office of $1 billion, while still impressive, was a drop compared to expectations. However, the film had a legendary marketing campaign, costing about $200 million, bringing the total budget to roughly $600 million. And here's something that might shock you. Despite being a billion-dollar movie, it actually didn't generate real profit. Since studios typically receive about 50% of box office revenue depending on the country, the result is that the film likely only broke even, and very modestly. Box office earnings of $1 billion are not what a studio expects after spending $600 million on production. So, we've covered the Avengers, Star Wars, and Avatar. Even if we take the highest budgets of all these films, none of them even comes close to the spending horizon of the true winner, Jurassic World: Dominion. And here we're talking about a production budget of $580 million, and that's after tax incentives covered a significant portion. Still, $580 million. You might not have heard that. $580 million for a single film. And this is the worst movie in the new dinosaur franchise, which earned the least, just $1 billion at the box office. Such expenses were largely due to 2020, when filming had to be halted in the middle of production. Old cast members returned, and they weren't working for free, just like the main stars, including Chris Pratt. When the pandemic changed plans, many locations had to be swapped, even though they had already been prepared. We've heard this a few times in this video, but $580 million still boggles the mind. For that kind of money, you could have filmed the first 3 Jurassic World movies. Including marketing, the film might even be considered a flop. Some outlets, like Forbes, reported profits of just $30 million, Deadline mentioned $200 million, and other less authoritative sources even talked about losses. I don't know if any movie will ever surpass such an inflated budget, especially now, when box office returns have objectively started to decline and never recovered to 2019 levels, and studios have stopped assigning such massive budgets. Overall, box office, expenses, and profits, it's all relative. But it's extremely interesting to analyze, and I wanted to share that with you. So what's the takeaway? A $350 to $500 million budget doesn't always guarantee huge profits. In fact, quite the opposite. The risks grow exponentially, because even $1 billion gross is no longer a guarantee. I hope you found this interesting. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.